It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the afternoon, Mark Rosenthal. That's a friend. Mark Blumenthal. Mark is a political pollster with deep and varied expertise across survey research, campaigns, and media. He worked as a campaign pollster for Democratic candidates until he created Mystery Pollster blog and co-founded the award-winning pollster.com website, which was acquired by the Huffington Post, where he served as a senior polling editor. I could go on, but you get the idea. He is an expert in the field of polling, and he's going to be telling us everything we always wanted to know about what happened. You're welcome.
All right. Thank you. First order of business is to make sure that everyone can hear me. I know this crowd, if you can't, you're going to let me know, but please let me know. And how about this? Okay, I'm not super experienced at speaking a quarter inch from the microphone, so I'm probably going to lose it from time to time. No, thanks. I'll just raise your hand if you can't hear me at any point. I am not offended. So thank you to everyone for the invitation. I'm gratified that so many of you wanted to come out on a rainy day to listen to little old me talk about what was for me and for many others a sort of a painful result. I had my doubts on the morning of November 6th that this was even worth the time, but I'm glad you're all here. As Roberta said, I've worn a lot of hats in my career. I've done a lot of different things, and the common theme throughout everything I've done is that, and what I think I'm good at, is explaining how polls work and what the numbers mean to reporters, to editors, to clients, to readers of my blog and my columns in HuffPost. And I'm going to do a little of both of that today, a little more on what the numbers told us about the campaign, but I'm going to work in a little bit about how the polls did and how they performed. And I'm going to talk about basically three things: what happened, and what the data tells us about the outcome of the election and how the polls did, and then two categories of why. So let's get into it, assuming everything's good. So I may have to click. So, and I apologize to everyone sitting here. If you can't see this, I may have to move a little bit out of the way. Can you see it? So this chart, I'll explain. You probably can't read the numbers, it doesn't matter. This is a representation of the final polling margin. Blue was Harris ahead, red was Trump ahead in the 7 battleground states and on the left nationally. And if you can't see the numbers, what they showed was a very, very, very close race. The tipping point state, the Pennsylvania, third from the right, this is the 538 polling average. There are other averages, they all showed essentially the same thing, was 0.1%. And if you followed, the polling on the news, which if you turned on the news, you saw constantly for the last couple of weeks, what you were told accurately was this was super duper close. It was the closest. My old colleague Harry Enton said on CNN that in the Electoral College, sort of the state level polling was the closest we'd seen in 50 years. And the tipping point state being that close meant all the forecasts were 50-50. And what you got was, oh my God, it's so close. It's so close. It may take 2 weeks to find out who's going to win. And everyone came in expecting this sort of photo finish. And that worried me. When people came up, the most common question I got for most of this year was what's going to happen. And my refrain to almost everyone was, hey, I don't know. And polling isn't going to tell you what you want to know. Why? Because of this. This is a chart showing the error, the average, the technically biased, whether the polls favored the Democrat or the Republican in every election going back to 1936. And you don't need to see all the little numbers to know that there's a fair bit of error. In fact, the average, probably about 2-3 points. And it was, up until the last 3 elections, somewhat unpredictable. I've learned the hard way that it is very, very hard to impossible to try to predict which way this error went. Now, what is this error about? You've probably heard of the margin of error. On any given poll, there's a margin of error. The margin of error is about doing a sample, and it's about the randomness in polling. So if you look at 10 polls on, say, the election, some are going to be too high, some are going to be too low, and sort of a random pattern. But when you start averaging polls, and these averages this year are based on dozens for every state, I don't know, more than that nationally, that random error reduces to near zero. And what you're left with is all the other things that polling can be wrong about. 3 in particular. Polls err here when the snapshot, which is a week, 2 weeks before the election, when people either change their mind or where their answer to pollsters concealed some uncertainty that resolves by the time they vote. So you'll notice the 3 biggest, 3 of the bigger errors up until 2020 were 1980, 1992, 1996, when there was a third party candidate. And those support for those people collapsed for John Anderson and for Ross Perot. That may have been because it was collapsing. That may have been because some said to pollsters, I'm for the third party, when they were really just unsure. The 2 others are the mechanisms that we use to try to figure out what the likely electorate are wrong, and they miss a dynamic. There's a heavier turnout among Democrats or a heavier turnout among Republicans. And I will tell you, this is the thing that polling does least well. And that is why you see a lot of that. And third, and probably much more relevant the last 3 or 4 elections, what we call non-response bias, a big $20 word for when the people who respond to the survey are different from the people who don't in ways that skew the partisan balance. So as a pollster, I knew there was a pretty good chance for error. Elliot Morris, the new editor of 538, a couple of days before the election, in his final column wrote about this and said that his election model estimates that the average error across the battleground states would be 3.8 points. And so he made the headline for his article, Trump or Harris are both a normal polling error away from a blowout, right? Accurate. I knew this. And that was what was on my mind when everybody would say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Look, one candidate well, let's just show you. So here's our chart that I showed you a minute ago. Let's take that 3.8 and put it on as an error bar. Can you see the bars? Obviously, they go well above and below zero. And what happened? Exactly that. So in red, there is the margin that Trump won all 7 battleground states by. And so what do we make of this? Let me start here and I'll show you on the other chart. It was a very close election. It just wasn't quite, there was a little bit of error that favored the Democrats and that concealed that Trump did a little better. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan ended up being within about a point. That's about as close as elections usually get. The other states were not as close as predicted. The national popular vote was off by a bit. So go back to the error chart. So there on the right in red is what the error ended up being this time. It was less than in 2020. It was a little more than at the national level. This is national. I could make this a 90-minute presentation and show you everything. Polling error was a little larger at the state level in 2016. It was considerably larger. So compared to the last 2 elections, polling did a little better. Compared to the last back to 1980 or so, it's sort of in the middle. It's not great. A bunch of you noted to me that there's an article today by Nate Cohn in the New York Times that goes over a lot of this in more detail, and I recommend the column. I'll come back to it. So let's move on from what the polling said to what actually happened. This is a different representation. Some of you may have seen it. It's a beautiful graphic from the Washington Post that took, in the lower right, you may be able to read it. It's plotting whether there was a shift from 2020 to 2024, either from where Trump's vote was higher than it was, which is the red arrows, which populate that map, and occasionally where Harris's vote was higher than Biden's, which is in blue. And the clear picture that you can see from even the back row is that there are a lot of red arrows. Basically, there was a small, very, very consequential shift almost everywhere. There's another pattern. I don't know if you can see it. If you look a little bit at Michigan, at Wisconsin, at Pennsylvania, you may not see quite as much red. Well, the shift in the 7 battleground states was 3.5 points. So Trump did 3.5 points better. His margin was 3 percentage points greater than it was in 2020. But in the other states, it was 7 points greater. So for any of you who were door knocking in Pennsylvania or North Carolina or joining text banks, or who have family who did or know folks who did, it did make a difference. The campaign did make a difference. And a 3-point, the campaign professionals will tell you, especially in a presidential campaign, that everything we do around campaigns might make a 2-point difference, right? That most of this just is organic, it happens. So if a 3-point, and it wasn't like Trump was running no campaign in these states. That's a big deal. Well, let's look a little deeper at the battleground state issue. This chart is a representation of what I should, forgot a thought. What we don't know, what I still don't know, and what we will learn more about over the next 6 months is how much of this shift is voters who changed, who voted for Biden and then switched to Trump, and how much is about turnout, about voters who stayed home or who turned out to vote for Trump for the first time. I think it's some of both, and there's evidence for that, but we'll begin to understand that in more detail over the coming months. This is a plot of turnout by state by a professor named Michael McDonald, friend of mine, who's one of the preeminent experts doing this. And the counting got final enough about a week ago that he put out this chart. And what it's showing you is the blue dots are turnout by state in 2020. The orange dots are 2024. The black arrows, which are mostly pointing this way, are suggesting that in almost every state, turnout went down. I know you can't read the state labels, so I'm going to show you that the 5 little green arrows, can you see those? Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada. 5 of the 7 battlegrounds. Turnout went up overall. There was one more little green one down there, North Dakota, where there was a highly contested Senate race. The other 2 battleground states, North Carolina and Arizona. North Carolina had very little change. Arizona was the one, and you may remember from the previous chart, it also had the most polling error. Hint, that may well have been what was happening there. So turnout's a big part of this story. I'll tell you also that there's some evidence that even in the battleground states, the turnout was lower in the bigger counties in several places, or at least not increased. So there are some countervailing trends there. While we're on this subject, this is my one and only chart for today from what we used to call exit polls. Since so much voting is now early, that's a bit of a misnomer. And there are 2 exit polls. One is the traditional one that's run by ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, that stations people outside of polling places, but they also do a big internet survey to try to get early voters, and they also send people to early voting stations. And then there's the one run by the Associated Press and Fox News, which is called Votecast, which is entirely an online mail survey done right before the election. And they both have the same function. They're both released on election day, and they try to tell us what happened, and we take them all way too seriously. Sorry to my friends who do that for a living. Why? Because they're still just surveys, and they still have error. And so here are 2 results that have gotten a lot of attention, and which I believe are true. That the Democrats did worse in 2024 among younger people, particularly 18 to 29, and among people of color, particularly Latino voters. And you can see the higher bars, but you'll notice these 2 charts aren't super consistent. They both do show that pattern I mentioned, but the ABC-CBS survey had a much bigger shift among Latinos, a smaller shift among younger people. Why? Because they're surveys. They have error, they have variation. And I'm looking at the comparison of 2 margins, which is like comparing 4 different percents, each with their own margin of error. So there's a lot of noise. We don't take, my cynicism about this is we treat them, we and the media, the cable networks and the networks that report these on election night, treat these as if they are precise, super precise. They're not. But I do think this is correct. And the initial look at turnout has sort of validated certainly the patterns by race in counties that are predominantly Latino or African American. So I'm going to stop here or I made a note, not stop the presentation, but take a breath and say, and give voice. Now I'm looking for my notes. I got way ahead. I want to give voice to the sort of primal scream that a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us felt, which is, huh? What? Why? Actually, I'm jumping. No wonder I'm jumping ahead of myself a little. Let's talk about why, and then I'll do the primal scream. Two categories of why. On the one hand, this was kind of a normal election. On the other hand, there are ways that I think we're living in a very new normal. So I'm going to do them in order. This is as wonky a chart as I'm going to show you. I know I was sitting with a political scientist. This is some classic political science. It's a chart done by a young, he's young to me, John Sides, a professor, John Sides, Lynn Vavrick, and I don't know Tesler's first name, but three very prominent millennial-aged political scientists. And it's a very simple chart. On the bottom, the x-axis, the lower axis, is the presidential approval rating in each year as taken in June. And the Y, the up-down vertical axis, is the percent of the vote that the incumbent party, whether it's that president or their vice president or somebody else, gets. And what's the point? Presidential approval in June is a really good predictor of who's going to win. In fact, the four of the dots that don't end up on the line, in two cases, the one on top, 1984, 1972, when Reagan and Nixon sort of outperformed their approval ratings. For those of you who remember those elections, that's just about all of us. You can remember why. And the 2000 and 1960, when vice presidents, Nixon in 60 and Al Gore in 2000, underperformed a little bit. The Bush line's right in the middle. So in June, on the 538 average, Joe Biden's approval rating was 38, which puts him right there. Can you see it in red? So that was predicting about 48% of the vote, which is what Kamala Harris got. So in simple terms, this is sort of what you'd sort of expect. Now, presidential approval takes in a lot. When you approve the president, it's not, it's not the one thing, it's actually covering a lot of things. So let's look more closely at that. This is that 538 chart of Joe Biden's approval. You will see the green line is the percent approved, the red line is the percent disapprove. It is over the full span of his presidency up until this week. You can see that it started out net positive and there was this decline over the first 18 months or so of his presidency. And there are two features. Let's just sort of walk through this. The sharpest decline is in August of 2021, which was right after the Afghanistan withdrawal when the news was awful about that. And so that's when it was sharpest. There's another notable moment after the Dobbs decision. That one looks a little more temporary. There's a bit of a dip. I'll tell you that was largely Democrats who were very, very unhappy and then essentially rebounded based on what he did. But to back up, there's that whole span from about May of 2021 through right before the Dobbs decision. What was that about? A little trickery here. That was about, well, in part, I mean, obviously the Afghanistan thing played a role and other things that were happening at the time, but that was the period when inflation was raging. And the decline in Biden's approval essentially ends when it stops. So one of the questions that comes up in conversations I've had is, okay, so all right, inflation got bad, but then it got better, right? The rate of inflation came down and people stayed mad at Biden. And we see this here. This is a question that we can ask directly. What matters to you? So this is a question that ran 4 times on the Yahoo News YouGov survey that I work on in September and October of this year. And we said, which one of the following, they saw a list of all 10 issues. Which of the following are most important to you in thinking about this year's election? And the result all year was very consistent. Now we changed the wording here from inflation to cost of living, notable. 39% Everything else way lower than that. So to finish my question from the previous slide, well, the cost of living, I mean, when we did this with inflation, the numbers were like 2 or 3% lower. It wasn't that much of a difference. But inflation got higher, so everything got more expensive. And then, as you all know, it stayed more expensive. Prices didn't come down. The rate of inflation leveled off. Prices didn't come down. Also, the interest rates remained high. So if you're trying to buy a house, it's still a lot more expensive. If you're renting, you know, your rents went up, they didn't come down, and they're affected by mortgage rates because it's the same market. All of that matters. Before we leave this slide, I just want to note something back on poll accuracy. This is one of many things that polls can tell us about the election that aren't about the horse race. Most of what we do isn't, what I do isn't about the horse race. And I don't want to be flip, but I don't really care if the absolute correct number there is 39 or 37 or 41. I wouldn't change our interpretation of this one iota, right? So yeah, polling may not be very accurate, may not be super precise at the horse race, where we really care about 47 or 48 or 44, where it's very consequential, but not so much nearly everything else we do. Just file that away and we'll come back to it. You can take that previous question. Now, this is a slightly more interesting graph, which I will explain, but this is the same question we were just looking at, but I've tabulated it by 3 subgroups. On the left and right are voters who, this is, and it's also, I should say, this was in our last survey right before the election, which had the race even when it turned out to be Trump by 1.5. Something I think was pretty damn good, pardon the technical term. So on the left and right are voters who were definitely going to vote. They said, I will definitely vote, not probably, not 50-50, not lower. And there's no chance I'll change my mind. I will definitely support Harris or I'll definitely support Trump. So Harris on the left, Trump on the right. In the middle, and graphically represented by being a narrower bar, are the roughly 20% who were either uncertain, probably or less, that they were going to vote, who said there was a chance they could change their mind, or who were totally undecided. In other words, in the middle are the people who decided this election. Don't know exactly which one of them's went. This was before the election, but okay, what stands out for me about this chart? I mean, like all things, your interpretation may be different, but I mean, obviously, looking at the top dark red is the mention of cost of living, and the middle group looks a lot like the one on the right. Certainly, cost of living, immigration, and crime were more than half of those in the middle. And notably, I think 1 in 5 of those who voted for Harris said cost of living was the issue they were thinking about most. This was the dominant issue of the election. This was the headwind that Kamala Harris had to face. My brain is telling me I meant to say something else about this, and I'll come back to if I need to. Oh, yeah, we're running late. Yep, I'll take one and it'll hold. Okay, all right. Let's keep on the vein of inflation mattering. This is a chart got a lot of attention. How many of you immediately recognize this? Anybody? Cool. then I get to share it with you for the first time. This is a chart done by I think he's an economist and he works for Financial Times. He's a writer for Financial Times named John Byrne Murdoch. And he took, this is similar to the ones we've been looking at. It's the rise and fall of the vote share for incumbent parties in, labels obscuring the title, but it's incumbents facing election in all the developing countries in mostly Europe and North America, and whether they rose or fell back to 1950. And his conclusion was, among these countries, this was the first year that every incumbent party lost vote. The red dot is the US. So lost vote, but less. Now, this has been a little controversial. I don't want to say controversial. There are folks who have attacked this and said, developing is doing a lot of work. It doesn't include Mexico. It doesn't include Ireland. There are countries that that didn't necessarily fit this pattern. But I don't think the point is that a loss of vote was inevitable for the Democrats. It's just the headwinds are very strong, and they were worldwide. This was not an entirely US phenomenon. This happened around the world, and it's important to put it into that context. And there's another factor. We've been talking about Biden's approval. This is Biden's approval and Kamala Harris's approval on those 4 polls we did in September, October. The number's a little higher because Biden did a little better. And it's also among registered voters where the other chart wasn't, whatever. It's a little different. It's essentially the same. But Donald Trump, same surveys. In September and October of this year, 49%. So Biden's approval rating, 44. Trump's approval rating, 49. In October of 2020, it was 44. So over the last 4 years, including January 6th, Trump got more popular, which begins to show you like what the thinking was of voters who backed him. My economic situation is worse, and my memories of the way things were under Trump are better. So let's go back and do that again. What about the Harris campaign and their messages? This one's a little challenging because I realize I could have made the text 10 times better and you would have had trouble hearing it. This is a survey we ran right after the election. And we did this both for Trump and for Harris. For time reason, I'm just going to show you Harris. And we read a series of about 10 different messages and asked, tell us how much you heard about this during the election. A lot, some, not very much, none at all. The chart is plotting a lot and some. So what people heard about. In purple on top are the battleground, where the number on the battleground states, in orange, the other states. So what you'll see is the number one issue at around a little over 70% was restoring abortion rights. Number 2, protecting the rights of transgender people. Number 3, creating an earned pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And 4, lower the cost of living for middle-class Americans. 5, cut taxes. So make of what you will. You know, the Harris campaign put a lot of money and time behind the abortion message. The Trump campaign put a lot behind the message on transgender rights and immigration. What is a little bit interesting, my takeaway from this is twofold. Well, one, take a look at the difference between the battleground, the 3 issues where there was more awareness of abortion, of Harris's lowering inflation message and tax message was in the battleground states. So the key takeaway is they were talking about it. They spent supposedly $200 million on ads that were specifically on the economy in those states, 70% more than Trump, or 70 million more than Trump. So it was heard, may not have been heard as loudly as some other things. But there's a sort of second part of that, which is, all right, let's restate it. We asked the same question about Trump. So here, 51% heard a lot or some about Harris's message on lowering the cost of living for middle-class Americans. 50% heard that about Trump. Same, it was a little different in the battlegrounds, higher for Harris than for Trump, 60 versus 46. And then we had another set of questions, which is essentially, do you believe it? And so 34% said that that statement about Harris was mostly true. 48% said it was mostly true for Trump, which is consistent with the notion that his job approval rating was higher, and the whole sort of, you know, the notion that, okay, if we change, if we get this president back, maybe it'll make a difference. So here is the time for my primal scream. Sorry, got a little confused. Don't know my own slides. Again, I think this is something many, Alan, not all, many of you in the room have felt, and forgive me if you don't agree, but really, why? He ran a disastrous campaign, didn't he? Isn't that what we heard? He didn't do a single interview on traditional news outlets in the campaign's final weeks. There was no national broadcast. He blew off 60 Minutes. He canceled interviews on, I think it was NBC. No town halls, no sit downs with local TV news. something that was a total staple of presidential campaigns. The only debate he was in, he only debated once, he lost. And weren't the voters bothered by, it was a convicted felon, he was found liable for sexual assault. He tried to overturn the election results and stage a coup. Didn't any of that matter? That George Conway, I don't know if you know who he is, doesn't really matter, but I like the way he put it. He said he represents everything we should aspire not to be and everything we should teach our children not to emulate. None of this mattered. Wasn't it disqualifying? Well, I'm not going to claim to have the full answer, but there's one important piece of it that I think, all need to understand. And that is this sort of new normal that we're in with respect to how everyone consumes news, and particularly those younger than you and me. So let's do a little bit of before and after. Early 1980, 52% of Americans told the the GSS, I forget the academic survey done at the University of Chicago, said, I read a newspaper every day. 75% said they read a newspaper at least once a week. 42% of television households were tuned into the 3 evening news broadcasts every night. This year, in the last 2 years, 14% read a newspaper. Okay, that there's that implies a physical newspaper. 24% read it at least once a week. 11% are tuned to the daily news or to the evening news every week. So we've had this massive change in habits, obviously the internet. Let's look at it another way. 1996, Pew Research, very classic question. Is there any way to move the? Yeah, I've got the preview, so I can't. All right, I'll just tell you what it says. It's basically, how have you been getting news about the election? From television, from newspapers, from radio, from magazines, from computer, online sources. The 2 big bars at the top are television, 85%, newspapers, 56%, radio, 21, magazines, 5. This is the world we all lived in and grew up in. Apologies to anybody who's a millennial in the room. There are 2 points I want to make about this before we go to today. One is, half were reading a newspaper on this list, right? So I remember learning about this. There was this sort of debate. Oh my God, people are relying only on television for all their news. They're not reading a newspaper. Well, the reality was these sources of news were kind of unified in a way. If you got a newspaper delivered to your house, you might not read the front section when you dove for sports or comics or whatever, but you saw the front page. You might not read what was in the newspaper, but if you listened to the news on the radio as you drove to work, or tuned on the morning show in the morning, or watched the evening news because you wanted to get the sports score, you heard those front page stories because they got rewritten and read aloud or revised, repackaged on a local news. And there was a compact number of, the number of sources was relatively limited. There is find the quote, I believe she's an academic named Naomi Rovik, who talked about her memory, like news was a scheduled event with little competition for attention. If you had your television on between 6:30 and 7 or 7 and 7:30 or whatever it was, the news was on. There was nothing else on unless you wanted to watch an old movie on the one other channel that worked on your television. And the values of news that you got, and I'm quoting now, fairness, balance, questioning a status quo, were bred into me every morning and evening. It was as familiar as water, right? That was the news environment that we worked on. And for when I worked on campaigns, which was from the late 80s through the 1990s, the basic, well, I'll come back to that actually. This is a very similar question asked by YouGov, the company that I do work with now, 4 or 5 months ago. Same basic questions, a little different, lots of categories now. Things like email newsletters, online news aggregators, podcasts, online video platforms. Those are toward the bottom. Television at the top, where it was 85, here it's 49. Social media is number 2, 46. Now, what the chart is showing you by age. So unless you're colorblind, the purple line is 18 to 29-year-olds. Note that social media is 58% of the mention by the massive difference. So Television is only 32%. Newspapers, obviously near zero, because we said print. There are 23% saying news apps, 34% news websites. But let's come back to like put this into some context. Again, Naomi Rovnick, young people now experience the news as part of a massive daily information dump. This comes from, she was teaching a class to Gen Z and talking to kids about like how they read news. And she said, they don't even quite think of it as reading news. They don't go out and look for news. It just, they just go onto their social media feeds and it shows up. The writer who shared this on, because I saw this on social media, on Blue Sky, there's a key generational divide here. To young people, there is no distinct thing called news, just stuff on screens. Maybe a little exaggerated, but I think that's basically right? And it makes our asking these questions is tough because they may not even think of it this way. This was a question I started explaining before it appeared. This is a question that my YouGov colleagues asked, and we asked on the Yahoo survey right before the election. And it said, when it comes to news about the 2024 election, would you say that you actively seek it out or actively avoid it? 47% said actively seek it out, 15 avoid it, 39 neither. So here's where I was. I don't think this is a particularly new phenomenon. This is not a question that Gallup asked 40 years ago, so I can't show you a trend. But it strikes me as about right that we would have gotten a very similar answer in 1980. And the tactic that the campaigns that I worked on, we knew that. We knew that there was a proportion of people who were reading the newspaper every day, who knew the news, and we were not going to move them. There was nothing we could tell them that would change their minds, but there was this huge other portion of people who weren't really actively following the news. And we could reach them with, where it was in statewide races, television advertising, and some congressional races, and sometimes with mail. But we could send messages. They would be seen because we could buy them on the 3 networks that everyone watched all day long. You can still buy television advertising. Campaigns still do it, but it's getting a much, much, much smaller audience. And this is important. We learned that advertising would be a lot more, it would probably not be effective unless it was a news story. Unless the things it was amplifying something in the news, propelling something into the news, reflecting things people knew. And we knew that if we could, if the ad worked well enough and it got on the front page, even if you didn't read it, you were going to learn about it because of all that stuff I talked about, because it was going to get on the local, it was going to get on drive time radio, it was going to get on the evening, the 11 o'clock news. That is the way I waged, the campaigns I worked on, and I stopped doing campaign work 20 years ago. That was the fundamental tactic. Here's what's not new, or I'm sorry, here's what is new. Same question, the vote for Harris and Trump by those 3 groups. Among people who actively sought out news at the end of the 2024 campaign, Harris led 52-45. Among those who actively avoided news, she was behind 48-33. Among those who were, neither, behind by 8. This is very similar. There were surveys that asked more conventional questions, including one of the exit polls, how much attention did you pay to the news? Harris did a lot better to people who followed it actively. Part of this is age, a big part of it, but this is an important clue to the answer to what's this new normal that we're in. So I'm going to finish by explaining a set of questions that we asked on the survey right before the election and trying to get at media use. And this is really hard. I mean, what we really like to do is look at what people are actually doing. We have to ask them questions and they have to tell us, report. I watched this. People aren't good. Human beings aren't good at telling you what they actually did. It's just like, did you exercise this morning? Oh, definitely. Did you watch the news? Yes. So we started with a question that was basically the one you saw, except we wanted to narrow it to the charts I show you allowed you to have multiple answers. I don't know if you did the math in your head, but people were giving, newspaper and television. We asked the question that was just, which one do you use most? And then a set of open-ended follow-ups, open-ended meaning we didn't give them categories. We said, what news source, what television network do you watch most? Do you prefer for news about election? Which podcast do you prefer most? Which which news site do you prefer most? And then so I get the verbatim answers that people typed in. And after the election, when things calmed down, I spent a day categorizing them, which you probably, can anybody read that? Yeah. Good. I'll know from next time. So I tried to code them into 3 buckets. Those that were pretty clearly partisan Trump or right, those were pretty clearly partisan Harris or left, and those that were more mainstream. Another, imperfection in this technique is that I know there are conservatives who might quarrel with the idea that NPR and CNN are middle. I called them mainstream for a reason. I think that's the distinction. MSNBC might not like being called left, but just go with me on this. I picked out, Trump examples, by no means an all-inclusive list. It was a long list. Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan were the kinds of things I coded as right. MSNBC, Pod Save America, Midas Touch, left. The major networks, NPR, New York Times, anyone who said local news, right? Now, there's a lot of room for noise in this. There's a chain of local news stations. The Sinclair group has bought up a bunch of local news stations, and there's a lot of Fox News-like content on them now. There's no way to sort of get at that. So this is imperfect, but similar format as before. These are well, I'll explain the categories. This is also tabulated by definite Harris supporters on the left, definite Trump supporters on the right, and the voters who decided the election in the middle. Starting from the top, the 37% on the right are the Trump right media, followed by social media. And then I took social media, and we had another follow-up question. I took anyone who was on the X platform or Truth Social. X, because there was a billionaire using it algorithmically to serve up Trump content to the people on it. I don't know if you want to call that in the same category as the other, but I think it deserves its own treatment. All the other social media programs in the sort of lightest orange, search engines, the very, very narrow sort of yellow, then the big blue, mainstream media, followed by the darker blue, Harris left, and then other, the green were conversations with people and people who we couldn't categorize. So what do I get from this? Okay, so obviously, mainstream media is getting consumed heavily by those who were absolutely certain to vote for Harris and much, much less frequently otherwise. A good third of those in the middle, not nothing. Remember, this is my caveat about these kinds of questions. This is self-reported. This is not necessary. This doesn't tell us anything about frequency. And then on the right, more than half, 37% watching Fox and other sort of similarly oriented sites or social media of some kind. And there's, I'll add one more thing, which is that question I showed you a couple before about actively. So what if I take this and just throw out anybody who isn't an active consumer of news? Same categories, I'll go back and forth, right? So what do we end up with? The mainstream media number for the 2 bars on the right are 18% and 12%. I think the point here is there's a vast section. There are 2 things happening here. We have a heavily partisan media for a lot of Americans now. That didn't exist 20 years ago. That is part of the normal. That is the answer in many respects to a bunch of those questions in my primal scream. How did Trump end up being the nominee again? Why did, I'm blanking on her name now, but the senator from Iowa who flip-flopped just yesterday about supporting Hegseth. Why did that happen? Because, Joni Ernst, thank you. Because those news channels and the paid media and all that threatened her with a primary, and she found religion real fast. No offense to her religion, right? But that is the dynamic that we live in now, right? It is a very different dynamic. That is not the way things would have played out in the 80s. Had similar kinds of stories happen. The other part are particularly, remember how much higher the social media number is for younger people. They're not watching and consuming, the majority are not watching and consuming mainstream media. They are acquiring information in a way that is completely unlike the way most of us grew up acquiring and consuming media. And campaigns are going to, I think they were, arguably the Trump campaign adapted to this better. Their targeting needs were narrower, but they won, and arguably they adapted to this better. And regardless, I mean, I'm not trying to resolve a debate about what the Harris campaign could or couldn't have done better. Modern campaigns are going to have to deal with this reality. And they're just at the beginning of figuring that out. I will close with two thoughts. The main one is, I think public opinion still matters. This was Chris Hayes. He said this on the day after the election, and it was meaningful to me. He said, public opinion and politics didn't suddenly disappear overnight because 3 out of 100 voters switched their votes. And he talked about how public opinion mattered during the first Trump term. And none of this stops. And to me, that's important because our ability to measure it still matters. It is really important that we have polling. And if you read the Nate Cohn piece this morning, he listed, it's not here on the slide, he listed, you should go read it, COHN in the New York Times, 7 or 8 stories that you learned about the election that you wouldn't have without polling. Like, I think I threw it into my notes. I did not. We knew that the Harris and Biden campaigns had a problem with voters of color. We knew that there had been you knew from some polls that the vote in states like Florida and Texas were looking like they were even stronger for Trump than they had been 4 years before. We clearly knew there were voters who were switching from Biden to not voting, or switching from Biden to Trump. That was clear in all the surveys I did. It was just a question of, were there enough? That is why the popular vote numbers were closer this time than they were 4 years ago. We knew a whole host of things. We knew about the importance of inflation as a driver of this election. We knew all of that because of polling, and the fact that polling did okay makes me hopeful, at least for what I do. So I'm going to stop there and take your questions.
Mark, if you'll identify a hand, I'll bring this over. But I'd like to just start by asking a question about the business of polling. If you have, how much is the gross polling budget over a year, and how much of that is campaign polling?
Two
Political,
good and really hard to answer questions.
Okay, we can skip it.
But the answer I'll give you, whatever it cost 5-10 years ago, it costs a lot more now. Telephone surveys, which used to be the mainstay. Can everybody hear me? Telephone surveys, which used to be the mainstay, are now well out of reach for nearly all applications. The air quotes high quality, I don't mean to besmirch them, but it gets used a lot, that phrase, and I don't love it. But Pew Research, CNN, do not do telephone surveys anymore. Their surveys are done online. So the costs are different, but regardless, it costs more. Campaigns, if you want to talk about the whole industry, including like market research, they're a tiny, tiny fraction of that. It kind of depends on how you define polling, right? If it's news media, if it's surveys about politics, most of the surveys that are done for campaigns you never see. And I think they're probably more done that way, just in terms of dollars or number of interviews. So there's a hand right behind you.
All right, and please give your name. Mine is Sid Booth, and talk like a rock star, real close to the mic.
I'll try to repeat it.
I'm Bill Brown, and the one thing I wanted to ask about was voter suppression. I wanted to know if anybody knows how many people were basically unable to vote. I've heard so many stories and seen so much of people who were not able to register. I've been on the phone doing ballot curing, and it seems to me like there was a successful campaign to keep people from voting. I just wondered if anyone had looked at that or done any surveys, or you had any comments.
Yeah, whoever the person is, sadly, it's not me. So did everybody hear the question? Okay, it's not me. That's a tough. I mean, there is a survey done every year, and I think it's being. I haven't seen it yet. It may be complete, and I just haven't seen it. by some academics at Berkeley, which is an annual sort of assessment of, they ask questions like, how hard was it to vote? Did you have trouble voting? It gets at the things you're asking about. I have not seen anything since the election that attempts to quantify any of that. It is hard to sort out, intent in that question, right? Because there are systems that have been placed forever that effectively suppress vote, even if there was not some campaign waged to have that effect. But I don't have a great answer. Behind you, Sid.
Hi, Arlene Lutnager. I think there are two elephants in the room that you haven't talked about. One is the gender issue, and the other is that Harris is a woman of color. And I think that there are certain subcultures in our country that would never vote for either one, no matter where they get their news.
Right. So that was one of many things if we had 3 hours, this would be a heck of a presentation, but we don't. Look, sexism, racism are obviously issues in our society, and there's no doubt that that's present for some voters. How prevalent and how much how important was it among those who voted for Biden last time but not Harris this time is a much harder question to disentangle. If you ask someone, was it, did you not vote for her because she was a woman, you're going to get the socially appropriate answer. There are other ways of getting at these questions that are, would be interesting to look at, and I just didn't. I think that the kinds of things you're talking about are most interesting in explaining how Trump ends up being the nominee of the Republican Party. I think they're probably less important to the outcome. I'm not willing to dismiss them out of hand because I don't know, but Gretchen Whitmer, Tammy Baldwin, Alyssa Slotkin, Jackie Rosen all won elections this time in those battleground states. It doesn't feel to me like, granted, only Whitmer won 2 years ago. The others were all this time around. The others are not executives. Maybe there's a glass ceiling for that. It doesn't feel completely out of reach to me, though, I'm sure it played a role in some places. I don't want to speculate beyond that. The other thing there are a bunch of charts I made or grabbed that I didn't show. This one's kind of interesting. It says whites disadvantaged. I didn't make this, I grabbed it. It's from the General Social Survey of the University of Chicago that has asked since 1992 a question about are white people disadvantaged by affirmative action? From bottom to top, Republicans overall, Democrats. So you can see there are more Republicans who say whites are disadvantaged. And this is one way of getting at, you interpret it as you wish. I would say there's some racism involved in that distinction. And what is interesting is that starting in 2014, Republicans increased on this and Democrats sharply decreased. So, race is part of our elections now. There's a really good, a column I appreciated today, Philip Bump in the Washington Post. I think it's online. I don't think it's in the print. Talking about identity politics as we just had a very successful campaign wage that was all about identity politics, this kind of identity politics. For some reason, if it's identity politics on behalf of being white, it doesn't count in that category for some reason. That's not a direct answer to your question, but that's what I got. Okay. Squeaky wheel. Oh, sorry.
Mark, could you get a little closer to the mic with your answer?
Oh, sure. And then we'll.
Ed Wendell. I don't, the question I'm going to ask, I don't think it was in there unless it was implicit, but I've been reading a lot about and thinking a lot about that a lot of I'm recognizing that he increased in almost every group, but it was marginal, recognizing all that. But the cultural and social issues, things and the idea that a lot of people just weren't being heard or their ideas were just being run over. And not without getting into the merits and just transgender issues or how it was presented, personal pronouns, use of Latinx, a lot of these things which the progressives and left have been now forced, not forced, have adopted as a given. And those issues, even if they weren't of utmost significance to the people who voted for Trump, it hit them the wrong way. So where does that actually, or did it actually factor into the election, recognizing that economics was the by far overwhelming issue that voters did vote
Right.
upon?
So a really good question. One I could probably, we ask lots of questions, and I'm doing this every time. Like I could come back here with a better answer than I'm going to give you. I did touch on it here. It was, so a little background. I don't know if everybody knows this. There was one particularly effective ad, and that it was the Trump campaign ran national ads over the last month of the campaign. If you're a male and you watch sports, you saw it. I did multiple times about, and it had a clip of Harris from 4 years ago talking about giving funding for gender transition surgery to prisoners, including those who were not documented Americans. It was like the trifecta of craziness, and it was coming out of her mouth. And then subsequently, they pulled a little clip of a famous African-American talk radio guy who was just talking about it, but in ways that he said, well, if I saw this ad, I would think. That part of it didn't end up in the ad. What he said after that did. It was, they spent a fortune. They ran it nationally, not just in the battleground states. And it had a pretty implicit, I think, economic hook. It said, she's for them, she's for they, them, not us. Right? It wasn't just, this is a crazy idea, but it's like, while the economy is going to hell, this is what they care about. That was clearly heard. I mean, this slide that I showed you says that the transgender was like the second most mentioned thing. Now, how important was that to the voters who switched? It's kind of hard to say. Everything's important. It certainly was part of what voters heard.
Yeah, it was the Willie Horton ad of the campaign. We have a question from the Zoom audience.
Hi, I think this was partially answered during your talk because the question was written during your talk, but it's from Chris Bowen, who says, I'm interested in the process of polling. My experiences from years ago when people actually answered their telephones. I never answer mine. So he said, and he asked, how is polling done now? Which I think you did answer. But at the end of it, he says, is it possible to be as accurate as polls used to be?
Okay, so I hope that the second chart I started with, sorry. I got it. I can chew gum and talk at the same time. I can't chew gum and talk at the same time. I could work my computer and then I move over and now I'm talking into the microphone. So this chart, which compared the error at the national level, I think answers that it's doing about as well as it has been doing since the 60s, which is good enough for, I think, most of us. I think that it would, like, my profession has this sort of double-edged sword that we live on. We like to, when we get an election right, we like to brag on it. Right meaning like perfectly right. But the polls aren't good enough to get, to have zero error. They're just not. And when a race is close and you care about the outcome, our answer should be, we don't know. And we want to be able to say we know, and that's hard. You and I work with YouGov. They spend a fortune on the modeling to try to get it, and of time and effort and money to try to get it right. And I think we did pretty well, but it's never going to be perfect.
Chris wants to know how you actually do the.
No, I think the other half of the question is sort of, how are we doing this? because the premise of Chris's question is nobody answers their phones anymore. We don't do surveys by phones largely. If we do them, I don't know, it's a longer question. We used to, so let me give you I think I actually have a slide show up, but when I started, the oversimplified way of saying this is when I started doing this, and probably when Chris did this, random sampling was why we trusted polling. That was the idea. If you were randomly selected, if it were up to us, it was a random chance, and we did everything possible, and we spent whatever amount of money it took to make sure that we interviewed the people we sampled, and we got a decent response rate, and we could trust that. And the attitude was, and you don't mess it up by putting your thumb on the scale and adjusting by various things. That era is over. It doesn't really matter whether the survey is done by phone or online or some other means. What we are getting back are not random samples. They're not even close. Many cases, we are not even starting with them anymore with random. What makes them good now is what we do the survey, either while we're collecting it or after it, how we weight, model, or otherwise obtain the right interviews. So what we have is a representative sample. So I did grab, I can find my cursor. There's a, I thought I threw this in here. That's it. Political scientist named Brian Schaffner, who runs the, he didn't put the name, the CCES. No one here knows that acronym. He runs a congressional campaign election survey, I think is the acronym that YouGov helps run. So he looks at a lot of survey data, and he's interested in it. And he did a kind of a, he went out and looked at what the public polling that we all consumed in all these states, what they weighted on when they disclosed it. Many don't. What they weighted on in 2016 and 2024. So 2024 is orange, 2016 is green. And one of the things that sort of steps out is almost all of the numbers are far to the right in orange, but particularly education. Polling is, this is a not great representation of the change. The weighting has gotten way more complex, not just since 2016, in the last 20 years. And what makes a poll good now is about what we're adjusting for and whether it's something valid to adjust for. And it's a much longer conversation, but that's how polling's different. That's why it's still good. And that's what, you know, as a consumer, what you'd want to understand, except I can't give you a sort of a checklist of what to look for. Okay, questions? Let's go here and there.
Sylvia Margolin. I really want to and like to fill out these surveys, but every time I've done that, it's always attached to fundraising by a party. So how do I get to the real survey and not to the fundraiser?
Well, thank you. And you've identified yet another problem of why it's so hard to get people to complete these, because there are so many others that are not. It's called, we have an acronym called it fundraising under the guise of surveys, frugging. And it's a problem. I mean, you have to be lucky, right? You have to be one of the chosen, so to speak. I didn't mean to do that pun. I want to go from right to left, whoever's got their hand up in order, so we don't make Sid walk back and forth, and then hopefully until we run out of time.
Oh, Alan Carping, this is really more of a comment than a question because of various things that are going on with me right now. I needed some comic relief, and that's why I came here. And thank you. And thanks to everybody, I think. I'm going to go away laughing. Trying to justify an election loss. You know what I think happened? Rachel Maddow has to stop looking like a snotty broad.
Okay.
All right.
We have 2 minutes left and you don't have a question. So next, who's, we have 2 minutes, so there might be time for only one or two. Go ahead.
Hi, Janet Walker Churlin. Could you comment on overall turnout, Democratic turnout? Would that have made a difference? I read somewhere that it wouldn't have.
Do you think that's true? Also, I heard that Trump's internal pollster always knew he was going to win. What figures is that person working with as opposed to you? Thank you.
Confidence is a great thing. Didn't Rabbi Zemel have a line about, you know, this was like a week ago, it was a rabbi who recently passed away during the Yurtside section of Friday night, and he knew him, and he said he had this line about people who are confident. It's like certainty. People are, I'm going to mangle it, but it was people who are certain, but it's not the same as being right. Pollsters are very certain about their stuff. It's a longer answer. I don't know. Turnout. Thank you. Say it louder. Thank you. This is one I left out, so I'll just share another chart. This is by NBC News. They looked at, they plotted turnout by county in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And you can kind of see the big blue dots are the large urban Democratic counties. We don't yet have individual level turnout, which will answer your question when it's completed over the next couple of months. But, and then it's plotted by Harris's vote percentage. So the fact that the lines are pointing this way says that as her vote percentage got higher in those states, turnout was generally lower. So yes, higher turnout would have made a difference. Now, how you get there is a much harder question. It is not just a function of going and knocking on more doors. You have to motivate people to want to vote. So the lack of motivation tells us as much about the election outcome as the motivation of those who did vote and switched. They're really largely the same people. Do we have time for more? Or are we?
If I can get up.
All right, one more.
One more, okay. Stu Schwartz is my name. I have one comment and one question. The comment is that I've been teaching broadcast journalism for the last 15 years. And one of the first questions that I have always asked my kids is, do you regularly sit down and watch either the network evening news or local news? And over the years, the number has dwindled to the point where now it is 0.
Do they get to the point where
And
they
these
say,
are
what is
kids-
the evening news?
Huh?
Is it at the point where they say, what is the evening news?
Not quite. Well, almost, yeah.
Yeah.
But basically, and these are kids in a broadcast journalism course.
Okay.
So go figure.
All right. That's not, so they would know.
Yeah, it's very
I would
painful,
hope.
very painful. Anyway, just one quick question. So Nate Cohen, in his column today, he said, when judged against the final results, the polls missed by a more or less average margin, which you've been saying. But then he says, and worryingly, they systematically underestimated support for Donald Trump for the 3rd cycle in a row. So
Yep.
why is that?
Yep. So I was talking fast, but I was trying to hit that. You remember at the beginning when I said like there are 3 reasons why polling can be wrong, and the last 2 are about polls not getting turnout well and about the people we interview being systematically different from the people we miss. I think that with Trump, in the intervening years, 2022, 2018, polling was actually better. We didn't have this same issue, and he was president, or, you know, the MAGA was certainly part of the talk. There is something about Donald Trump has very, very successfully motivated turnout among a group of voters who haven't voted otherwise. And we're not great at, and we may still be missing some of them. We pollsters have gone to great length to try, you know, after 2016, that's what that waiting on education was about, to try to compensate for those people we might not be getting. And we're getting, you know, I think the polling is doing better, but per Nate, we're not all the way there. And 3 in a row means there's this persistent problem that we have not completely solved and may not. And, you know, what we won't know for another 4 or who knows how many years is this going to persist when Trump's not on the ballot and there's some other similar candidate? So thank you, everyone.